Hello. The Empire of Warhammer Fantasy is one of the most iconic and intriguing factions in the game, a nation that draws on real-world history, steampunk science, and magical mayhem. Unlike the medieval kingdoms of Tolkien's Middle-earth, or even Warhammer's own Arthurian legends, the Bretonnians, the Empire is uniquely positioned both geographically and within the story of Warhammer. But when did it first become a part of the setting, and how did it develop over time? That is exactly what we're going to look at today. I'm Jordan, this is Martha, and you're watching Jordan Sorcery, and today we're exploring the origins and development history of the Empire. Now, we all know that the human kingdoms and empires of a great many fantasy settings take real-world history as a starting point when it comes to building out their worlds and the look and the feel of those factions. In Tolkien's Middle-earth, the nation of Gondor might be said to parallel aspects of the Normans and the Vikings. The Rohan draw on the medieval Anglo-Saxons. In Game of Thrones, there seem to be kingdoms styled after medieval England, France, and Spain. Even Warhammer takes on the influence of many Arthurian legends, popular in the Middle Ages. Whilst that is a huge expanse of human history and culture in the mix, they do often share some similarities in their depictions of armoured knights and sword-wielding soldiers. The Empire in Warhammer are something different though. More recently known as the Empire of Man, this faction would move away from the Normans and the Knights, the Barbarians and the Feudals that had defined the early ranges of Citadel human miniatures, and would go on to take inspiration from one of Europe's longest-lasting Germanic empires, and the style and equipment of 16th century mercenaries, with a rich background developed for role-playing adventures, and a diverse army that could be turned to any strategy on the battlefield. The Empire would become the bulwark of the old world, standing against chaos, and one of the key factions in the stories of the Warhammer world that would play out not just on the tabletop, but in the books as well. This is Building Warhammer Armies, the series where I take a look at the history and the evolution of 40k and Warhammer Fantasy Armies over the years, trying to trace back everything to that single point of creation, if there even was one, and the iterations that have led us through different editions to the armies we recognise today. In Warhammer Fantasy, the Empire has long held a central place in the setting, the largest nation of humans, occupying lands at the crossroads of the old world, attempting to unite the forces of good against the impending incursions of chaos and the end times. Now, of course, this being Warhammer, there is no such thing as a truly good force. Beneath the surface, this kindly nation of noble warriors has a lot of darkness. Founded by the man who became a god, Sigmar Heldenhammer, who united the various tribes of men in common cause against the goblins, the Empire sits in the centre of the Old World continent, bounded by a western border with Bretonnia, a coast on the Sea of Claws, mountains to the south that separate it from the Darklands, and an eastern border with Kislev. The great forests play host to many dangerous foes such as the Beastmen, and from the mountains, endless greenskin hordes invade. And, of course, there is the ever-present threat of chaos that lies not just without, but very much within. The politics of the Empire are complicated, with many nearly independent electoral provinces and city-states, whose leaders elect an emperor to rule over them. But for much of its history, the venal rivalries of the elector counts has meant that there was no emperor agreed upon, and for fully 1,000 years the throne was contested. It is only in the past 200 that the Empire has been united again under a single emperor, most recently Karl Franz. It is a place of industry, invention, nobility, and magic, but it is also a place where corruption bubbles just below the veneer of respectability and honour. Cults and corruption might just make the entire Empire fall to chaos before a single battle even takes place. The Empire is a fantastic invention, a backdrop for many stories in the Warhammer world, and an arguably perfect blend of good, evil, and I'll pick my own side characters. On the battlefield of fantasy battle, it fields heroic knights, restrained wizards, disciplined foot soldiers in fancy costumes, and is led by an impossibly noble emperor. On the streets of fantasy roleplay, however, it is a seedy civilization of grim peril, where the down are trodden and the corruption of prescribed cults reaches to the very top of society. So, how did it become such a complex nation with a rich and, at times, contradictory backstory? And more to the point, when did it stop being just another nation of medieval knights like we see in many fantasy settings, and become something far more interesting? The first edition of Warhammer Fantasy was conceived by Citadel head honcho Brian Ansell as a set of rules that could justify players using all of the miniatures they owned, and then compel them to buy even more. Ansell wanted role players, the people who were already buying minis from the Citadel range, to stop getting just 1 or 2 orcs for their RPG sessions, and instead get entire hordes of them. And to do that, he would need players to collect armies. To begin with, there was no coherent, shared Warhammer world in which games were intended to take place. No land for the armies to fight over or defend. In the same way that the first D&D had initially expected dungeon masters to build their own worlds to explore, Warhammer was supposed to be played in whatever setting the players wanted to make up. It simply hadn't occurred to creators Richard Halliwell, Rick Priestley, and Ansell himself that a uniform, official setting was necessary. There was a bestiary section in that first edition though, with plenty of inclusions and stats for the kind of stuff you would expect to see in any popular fantasy range of the time, as well as stuff that you could already get in your Citadel historical ranges. Of course, there would be mention of elves and dwarves, halflings, orcs and goblins, but most importantly for the history of the Empire, there would also be the inclusion of men. Citadel fighting men are available to meet the requirements of the most demanding commander. C37, 38 and 39 provide an assortment of medieval and Dark Ages warriors, together with Arab types and fearsome Vikings. Armour and weapons will be as depicted. In Warhammer's first supplement, 1983's Forces of Fantasy, we would start to see the real world used to inform the creation of a brand new fantasy setting for the game. It wasn't anything too complicated at this point. We didn't get the introduction of the Empire or even Bretonnia, but there was a subdivision of the men that had been included in the bestiary of the base game into 4 different distinct entities. You would get men of the East, men of the North, men of the Orient, and men of the West. The men of the kingdoms of the West live in well-ordered communities with large towns and cities. Their society is highly and rigidly structured on a feudal basis. Lords, knights, townsfolk, and lowly peasants. In charge of each country is the king, who keeps a court consisting of the most valiant, chivalrous, cultured, and bigoted nobles. The various kingdoms are different to a degree, and fight amongst themselves when not otherwise engaged. Of particular note are the religious orders, warrior monks who belong to one of the Templar or Hospitaller organisations. They are very dedicated individuals with a burning hatred of foreigners in general and non-Westerners in particular. The chief enemy of the kingdoms of the West are the Easterners, godless heathens who deserve to be cut down mercilessly, and the Norse, unshaven barbarians who deserve to be cut down mercilessly. It's clear that Rick Priestley and Richard Halliwell are already drawing on the nature and insular politics of medieval kingdoms of Europe in this small passage, and having plenty of fun with history as they do so. We can't forget too that there's of course Lord of the Rings references at play here as well, as you would find in Middle-earth the Dunedain or Men of the West. The second edition of the game, released the following year, would do even more to establish this new, real-world influenced fantasy world. Alongside the likes of elves, beastmen, halflings, and ogres, it is made clear that the humans are the dominant race in what is now called the known world, with entries for the Arabians, the Norse, steppe nomads, the Amazons of Lustria, and, as they were called at the time, the Orientals of Cathay and Nippon. There were also the antecedents for the Bretonnians and the Empire. Old Worlders, or Men of the West, come from the Old World. The Old World is rather like Europe as it was during the Middle Ages. It is made up of many independent states of varying sizes. Although the Old World includes dwarf kingdoms, it is dominated by humans. The Old Worlder language can be spoken and understood by all humans within this area, despite some extreme dialect variations. Old Worlders are white-skinned, usually have brownish hair and green or brown eyes. Most Old Worlders can be considered neutral. The north of the Old World is technically and socially primitive, 11th to 13th century Europe, whilst the central areas are slightly more sophisticated, 13th to 15th century Europe, and the south is the most advanced, 15th to 16th century Europe. Gunpowder weapons are totally unknown in the north, but are widely accepted in the south, although even here they are crude and far from common. Already including the distinctions between the influence of different eras of European history is an interesting one, even if it's not reflected in the miniatures available for the game at the time. But it is an idea that would become even more important once the nations of the old world begin to take shape with later editions. The known world was becoming a true setting in its own right, and with the addition of about 30 issues worth of White Dwarf material, there would be plenty more added to this burgeoning realm. Chaos dwarves, orcs, goblins, skeletons, imperial dwarves, and ninjas, to name just a few. But at this point, the Empire was still just a glint in Rick Priestley's eye. The focus for Warhammer's supplements to this point was predominantly the New World. Richard Halliwell had a great love for Lustria, the Slan, Amazons, and the Norse, and so he wrote several scenarios set amongst them. The campaign pack Bloodbath at Orc's Drift was similarly set on Warhammer's American-inspired continent, and the tragedy of Macbeth took place on the island of Albion. Only Terror of the Lichmaster took place in the Old World, but even that concerned itself more with the outskirts of civilization than with the heart of the continent, defining the people and kingdoms and empires that resided there just hadn't come up yet. During this period, it was very clear that what was included in the Warhammer setting, in the rules, was being driven by what was available in the Citadel ranges. Now, this may always have been the case, it may still be the case, that what's available or being created for miniatures is what then gets rules in the game. But in this instance, they were actually looking back to what already existed, allowing players to use what they already had in their collections or that you could already buy from Citadel ranges. Rules weren't necessarily being created and then miniatures created to fulfill them. It was very much what you could buy was what you could play. Since the start of the Citadel Fantasy range, there had always been miniatures designed around the Dungeons and Dragons hero archetypes, as well as the types of characters and enemies that might be useful in a general RPG session. Goblins, wizards, warriors of chaos, dragons, and the like. Many of the heroic fighters took the form of armor-clad knights and paladins, bare-chested barbarians, or cloak-shrouded rogues. And with Citadel's expansive range of historical miniatures, including those imported from Ralpatha, and the love that prolific sculptors like the Perry twins had for making historicals, it was unsurprising that much of the fantasy lineup would draw directly on real history for its aesthetics and design. This seems a likely reason why the Warhammer world is so closely inspired by real-world history in the first place. It is the perfect excuse for samurai and knights and ninja to be fighting against dwarves, zombie dragons, and skeletons. In October 1986, an updated range of C26 Fantasy Men-at-Arms was advertised in White Dwarf issue 82. Citadel Miniatures are proud to announce the release of a new range of 25mm feudal warriors, designed by the deeply chivalrous Perry twins. No chaos, no spiky bits, just superbly detailed miniatures, ideal for wargamers and role-playing gamers alike. The set includes foot knights in varying styles of armour, as well as a selection of men-at-arms, including a longbowman and a crossbowman. Feudals in Warhammer. These figures are ideal for use in the armies of the Old World, especially the northern and western areas such as Bretonnia and the Empire. Given that these are feudal-inspired miniatures, these men of the West and potential men of the Empire still shared a lot of common design elements with typical knights, almost all wearing full chainmail with enclosed or bucket helmets, though I will admit that from a distance I first thought Dieter was going into battle topless. As a fun note, some of the C26 Citadel range are actually still available to buy today from the Foundry, the company that Brian Ansell would create after Citadel. This new C26 range was suggested as perfect for an Empire army, but really it looks exactly the same as you would use for a Bretonnian army, or for any other Men of the West army. It didn't have any unique factor to it. There was nothing aesthetically the Empire about it, because up until this point, the Empire was just the same as all of those other factions. But it was this moment, this very month, this issue of White Dwarf that would mark a turning point for the Empire and for the Old World as a whole, because this was when Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was released, and the entire setting would emerge from its chrysalis and become a grim and wonderfully perilous butterfly that would change what we knew about Warhammer forever. Of all the countries of the Old World, the Empire is the largest. It comprises a vast conglomeration of princedoms, duchies, leagues, and city-states, and it is assumed that beginning player characters have their origins somewhere within its boundaries. With the creation of fantasy roleplay came the increasing sense of the Empire as a central location for the stories of Warhammer, and whilst there would always be tales of other lands throughout the game's history, it would be hard to argue that the Empire and the Old World were where the central conflict of the setting was really happening. It's no accident that the new Warhammer is actually called the Old World, after all. And it is the Empire that is at the heart of the new default in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. The core book for WFRP added a huge amount of detail to the many denizens of Warhammer's known world, but that particular focus on the peoples, nations, and geographies of the Old World would create something incredibly rich and vibrant. The land was populated with named rivers and forests, cities and villages. Customs, cultures, methods of transport, currencies, political systems, and religious ideologies were all discussed in detail, and the Empire was expanded as a rich background against which to adventure, both in the core book and in the momentous supplements that followed. The Empire, greatest land in the Old World, is under attack, not from enemies on its borders, but from within. They wait for the day when they shall pour out of the forests to burn the cities and claim the Empire for chaos. According to various omens, that day is coming. This pack is more than an adventure. It contains information on the Empire's history, politics, religions, peoples, and geography. This information provides you with extensive knowledge of the Empire and will be invaluable as the campaign unfolds. The Enemy Within, written by Jim Bambra, Phil Gallagher, and Graham Davis, was the first volume of an extensive campaign that would see players travel the Empire and the Old World in an effort to uncover insidious, chaotic plots and protect mankind from the evil machinations of madmen. Across the campaign, there would be a wealth of detail about how the Empire operates at the ground level, what it looks like, and who lives within it. Middenheim would be explored in detail in Warhammer City, and many other famous locales in the Empire would be given an enormous wealth of character, alongside the incredible information about the Empire's laws, the typical dress of its inhabitants, how coaching inns worked, and the prescribed cults to be guarded against. The Enemy Within included an image of Imperial soldiers that featured hints of the visual identity that would later dominate the Empire miniature range. There was also some general information on the knights, soldiers, halflings, and other infantry that made up the standing armies of the Empire. Of course, given that this was a roleplay supplement, it was understandably more interested in the textures and fabric of the Empire itself that could help weave interesting stories, rather than the strength of its armies. In theory, Emperor Karl Franz has absolute control over all aspects of imperial society. In practice, however, his power is limited by a whole range of special privileges granted to various offices by the edicts of his predecessors, and the crown is really only maintained out of a strong national sense of historical necessity. The last time the Empire lacked a recognised figurehead, it was almost wiped out by the incursions of chaos. Magic would remain a notorious thorn in the side of WFRP's creators, and in the fantasy battle game, it would evolve considerably over editions as well. There'll be time to talk magical history in a future video, but I must point out that the article in May 1989's White Dwarf issue 113, which would introduce the colleges of magic to the Warhammer world, is an important one. It moved the various schools of wizard that would become commonplace in the Empire armies away from the likes of elemental, demonic, and necromantic magic that had been available in the past, instead taking on the different colours of magic. There would also be some accompanying art by Gary Chalk, like this full-page spread, which may be one of the earlier examples of the kind of imperial soldiery we'll soon be seeing plenty more of. The first and second editions of Warhammer Fantasy Battle had included the Men of the West, and even the Old World, but they were not centred around that geography, or the kingdoms that occupied it. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay changed that, making the Old World the default setting for adventuring in the Warhammer game, and the Empire itself became the largest and most important nation, an anchor point for the entire world. The medieval influence and feudal knights that had populated the lands that became the Empire were replaced by something, I think, far more unique and interesting. WFRP and the soon-to-be-released 3rd edition would, instead of the Middle and Dark Ages, draw their inspiration from an earthly empire that had existed for almost 1,000 years. The Holy Roman Empire. Voltaire famously wrote that the Holy Roman Empire was in no way holy, nor Roman, nor an empire, and truthfully, I am not expert enough to contradict him, but there are plenty of facts that we can agree on. It was an empire that existed for the better part of a millennia, so it grew over time, and shrank and shifted, but for 300 years of its history, the throne of the empire was occupied by the House of Habsburg. At its peak, the Holy Roman Empire commanded a huge swathe of Central Europe. Modern countries like Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Denmark, the Czech Republic, Poland, parts of France, and much of Italy would fall within its borders. For a number of complicated reasons, the suggestion was that the Holy Roman Empire was the descendant of the Roman Empire, and it inherited, borrowed, or stole whatever it could to claim the legitimacy of that lineage. It's a fascinating period of European history, one that I don't know nearly enough about. But what concerns us now is just how inspirational the HRE was for the writers of Warhammer. Many of the things that caused Voltaire to call it out were the same that would be borrowed for the creation of Warhammer's empire. For instance, despite being a Roman empire, the HRE was arguably a Germanic one, covering most of modern Germany. Its capitals moved with its emperor, but they included not Rome, but Aachen, Vienna, Frankfurt, and Prague. What's more, it wasn't really an empire at all. Sure, there was an emperor, and it had an outer border, but the reality was that it was more often than not a federation of kingdoms, principalities, and free imperial cities. Complex political institutions were in place to enable some degree of control, taxation, and mutual defense, but it was far from a perfect union. The emperor himself was actually elected into office, with various prince-electors and powerful archbishops all having a vote. The winner was crowned king in Frankfurt, and then crowned again by the Pope in Rome as the Roman emperor. On Voltaire's question of religion, the Holy Roman Empire was established as a Catholic realm, but over time it would accept many Christian ideologies. Given the nature of the HRE, as a collection of different states and kingdoms under one throne, it should come as no surprise that there were rivalries and agendas, and some degree of political instability throughout its life, even leading to some brief interregnum periods where there was no consensus on who should actually be emperor. So, the Holy Roman Empire was a huge human empire that took control of an enormous amount of land in what would become modern Germany and most of Central Europe. And it would have an elected emperor with many city-states and provinces responsible for putting them into power. And it would have 8 colleges of magic. Wait, not that last one. But you can see how I can get confused because the Holy Roman Empire bears so much similarity, at least on the surface, to what would become Warhammer's empire. And the Wolfrup writers drew incredible inspiration from all of that rich history, turning it into something fantastic and exciting. But even as Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was drawing on the language and the makeup, the geography, the politics of the Holy Roman Empire in order to inform the creation of this incredibly interesting new empire for Warhammer's setting, it was still taking some time for the armies of the empire to make their way onto the battlefield. 1987's Ravening Hordes was essentially an update to the Forces of Fantasy, a book of army lists for all of the major factions in the Warhammer Fantasy Battle game. There would continue to be support for nations like the Elves and the Norse and the forces of Nippon, but on page 51 we would finally get the first ever army list for the Empire. The Empire is a vast nation containing several different races, disparate townsfolk, and the followers of many religions. The following list covers most possible imperial armies: the garrison of a major city, an imperial expedition, the gathering of one of the large orders of knights, or even the emperor's own entourage. This was the first time an Empire army list was available for the game, and it arrived with a large number of units and ideas that are still relevant to this day. Although the feudal knight is no longer the default soldier of the Empire, they are still included with a number of orders of knighthood. There are military orders of Templars attached to several religious cults of the Empire, notably those of Ulrich, Myrmidia, and Sigmar. Trained and equipped to the higher standard, their uncompromising fervour makes them universally feared and respected. And there were also Imperial Guard Cavalry and Knights Panther, the latter of which may well have been included because John Blanche's personal picture of such a knight was so good that Games Workshop licensed it from him for White Dwarf issue 83 and then used it every single chance they got. There are Foresters and Levies, Arquebus and Blunderbuss troops, as well as cannon and bombardiers. The latter-day cornerstone of the Empire Army, the Halberdiers, would also appear in the list, along with pikemen and crossbowmen as well. Halfling Foragers were included in the list too, as the only non- or demi-human unit available. Besides the Holy Roman Empire, there's a less historical influence that has been cited for the tone and feel of the wider Warhammer world, and the Empire in particular, especially one of the units included in this list. Terry Gilliam's Jabberwocky is an incredible movie of absurd grubbiness, and there are some great scenes featuring a group of zealots.
Are you listening?
The Flagellants would become an ever-present part of the Empire's lineup, and they were ranting and raving from this very beginning. The Empire is full of religious zealots, some of the most devout, or twisted, of whom turn to flagellation in order to reach divine awareness. Flagellants often accompany the Empire's armies. Regular troops regard them with an understandable amount of reserve, and frequently complain about the unceasing whipping and groaning, keeping them awake all night. And there is another unusual unit in this army list, the High Helms, a unit of cavalry of prodigious size. This is the most recent of the orders of knighthood. The High Helms are elite cavalry, chosen from the toughest, most righteous, and tallest of the land. While minor considerations like intelligence aren't prerequisites, nobody can even be considered for the High Helms unless they are at least 6.5 foot tall. This unusual unit was presumably inspired by the Potsdam Giants, a Prussian unit that existed between 1675 and 1806. The kings of Prussia would seek out soldiers over 6'2", and friendly monarchs would even send their tallest recruits as tokens of goodwill. The third edition for Warhammer Fantasy Battle was an incredible book that revolutionised the game, for better and for worse in many different ways, and it would fully embrace the new conception of the known world that had been introduced in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. The Empire is the largest and most prosperous of all Old World nations. It is currently, Imperial Calendar 2512, enjoying a period of unification and relative peace under its elected Emperor Karl Franz I. Religious and regional disputes are still common, however, and there is the ever-present threat from chaos bands and other miscreants living in the forests. The danger to the Empire within its own borders should not be underestimated. The growing bands of chaos creatures and the rise of underground chaos cult worship are all indicative of a general increase in the activity of the incursions of chaos. Internal strife is often a feature of many nations in the Warhammer world, probably so that battles between the same factions feel like they make sense on the tabletop, and the spectre of chaos in the Empire makes for some suitably high stakes. In retrospect, it seems almost inevitable that the Empire's fight against chaos would become a central theme and story of Warhammer. Stuff like special rules for Foresters and Flagellants in the Empire armies was included in the core book as well, but there wasn't a great deal more about the Empire. Interested readers were advised to go and seek out Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and the Enemy Within if you wanted to know more about that part of the setting. But there would be a release very soon that would once again bring together the armies of the Empire, experiment with new things, and establish stuff that would remain in this army list for editions and decades to come. Warhammer Armies, written by Nigel Stillman and friends, was released in 1988, an updated collection of army lists for the major factions in the game. The Empire army list would lean heavily into these new Germanic influences, with cavalry units like Temple Ritterbrüden, Stadsknecht, Hochenknecht, and Kriegsritter. We would get Reichsguard that would stick around for the long haul, as well as crossbowmen called Armbrustschützen and peasants called Landstrom. Flagellants were now known as Fledglers, and you could take Bergjäger Scouts or Reichskannonbatterien. I'm pretty confident I pronounced all of those words wrong. There would be reference in the colour plate for the Empire to the knightly order, the Knights of the Fiery Heart, as well as to the gunnery school of Nuln, but the appearance of a typical Empire soldier is still not quite what we might recognise. And amongst the Old Worlder mercenary contingent near the back of the book, there would be an entry that would eventually define the Empire army, the Nullner Landsknecht. The city of Nuln is famous for its good, disciplined, steadfast infantry. The pikemen of Nuln are renowned throughout the Old World and much sought after as mercenaries. They sometimes have supporting units of halberdiers, axemen, or two-handed swordsmen. Today, arguably one of the most iconic features of an Empire army are the troops styled after the Landsknecht, the German mercenaries of the pike and shot era. Wearing multicoloured, puffed and slashed outfits, and variously equipped with pikes, halberds, crossbows, bows, swords, guns, and two-handed greatswords called Zweihanders, the Landsknecht became the cornerstone of the Holy Roman Imperial Army by around the start of the 16th century. These warriors wore striking uniforms that were quite distinct from the feudal mould that much of Citadel's classic human fighters had been cast in. In time, the style of the Landsknecht would come to dominate the Empire just as it had the HRE, marking them out as a very different force to the Bretonnian armies of the Old World and the medieval-style kingdoms that had previously occupied the central landmass of the Warhammer world. It wasn't just men of the Old World who were bringing Landsknecht style onto the catwalks, though. There would be plenty of dwarves and humans donning the little fluffy jackets as soon as they arrived in the game. Many of those miniatures were being created by a brand new company, Marauder. Issue 106 of White Dwarf announced that Citadel stalwarts Ali Morrison and Trish Carden, then Trish Morrison, were forming a new miniature company to be called Marauder. The initial focus for Marauder was on orcs, goblins and dwarfs, but soon they would also produce plenty of ogres, monsters and men as well. Marauder's initial human fighters were very much in line with the Citadel ranges that came before them, but with 1988's MM61 Fighter Command, Ali Morrison would fully embrace the puffed and sashed outfits of the Landsknecht. Ali Morrison's MM10 dwarves would also introduce a few oddities, like dwarf wizards and this chap with a particularly fancy hat. And then with the MM15 range in 1991, we would get to see dwarf warriors wearing the outfits of the Landsknecht too. And the dwarf spearman regiment of that same year were just unmistakably schnechty. Even as late as 1989, if you were to look through the various Citadel and Marauder catalogues, you'll find that there isn't a clear Empire range. You're still expected to assemble your units and your armies by collecting up lots of different miniatures from stuff like the Foot Knights and the Fighters and the Historicals and the Men-at-Arms ranges. And then together, that can create your Empire army. The 1989 Citadel Mail Order catalogue would list some of the fighters' blister packs as Knights of the Empire, and these models could still represent Reichsguard Knights to this day. By 1991, the Knights of the Empire range had been further expanded, and now included some classic miniatures like the heroic fighters of the known world that were sculpted by Jez Goodwin. There were also some knights who weren't wearing full plate armour too, though the majority still looked like the classic feudal knight. The Empire army as we would largely recognise it today really started to come together in the days running up to the release of Warhammer's 4th edition in 1992. Over the course of several White Dwarf issues, there was an explosion of new content exploring the nature of the Empire and its force of arms. Issue 146 would feature a Nigel Stillman article about the Army of the Empire, which would cover the broad makeup of the fighting force, as well as further embedding the ideas of how exactly this nation functioned. The Empire is the largest and most powerful of all the many and varied realms of the Old World. Although the Empire is usually referred to as if it were a single powerful realm, it is really a union of provinces and city-states, each of which enjoys considerable independence. Provinces are ruled by a count who maintains his own fighting forces, issues his own coinage, and levies his own taxes. This aspect of the Empire would give rise to one of its most important features as a tabletop army, the absolutely enormous variety of colour schemes. This White Dwarf issue and the next would include several pages of diagrams showing off many of the new troops of the Empire, dressed to the nines in their armours, puffs and sashes, and with the diverse colours of the provinces and cities of the Empire. There would be the introduction of the Knights of the White Wolf when speaking about the various knightly orders, reiteration of the importance of the Knights Panther, and brief references to the High Helms and the Knights of the Fiery Heart. Pistoliers would receive some considerable detail, as would the presence of Imperial Dwarfs and the Halflings of the Mootland. It's probably also worth mentioning the arrival of the Grand Theogonist, a sort of Sigmarite pope who is the spiritual protector of the Empire. Other introductions of note are the new technologies of this empire, the mighty war wagon, and the less than reliable but still formidable steam tank. A fun bit of continuity in this is the description of the Imperial School of Engineers, a community that includes a great many exiled dwarfs, including at one time Sven Hasselfresian, who would later build a steam-powered boat and sail to the New World, which, of course, is where he would become the Magnificent Sven, made famous by Warhammer 2nd Edition's scenario by Richard Halliwell. The steam tank, though, wasn't created by the Imperial School of Engineers. Instead, it's actually attributed to Italian inventor Leonardo of Miragliano, and it is said that there have only ever been 12 such vehicles in existence. Both the war wagon and steam tank would feature crew sculpted by Michael Perry, but the war machines themselves were sculpted by straight-line master Norman Swales. This introduction of engineers' guilds and steam tanks and wild weapons like hand repeaters was the beginnings of a strain of steampunk technology that would remain with the Empire Army through to the bitter end. The following issue of White Dwarf would feature a full army list with entries for all of these units, as well as the likes of Kislev horse archers and winged lancers, halberdiers, greatswords, and volley guns. It also kept the option from the original Warhammer Armies book to field a very themey baggage train that only serves to give the enemy more victory points if it's looted, and there were more wonderful examples of Empire troops and their colour schemes illustrated by Michael and Alan Perry. The Perry twins would actually be responsible for many of the new miniatures in the Empire range, leaning into their long-held love of sculpting historical soldiers, but with enough Warhammer fantasy in the mix to make them work well. All of this army list detail and even more lore would be included in the first ever faction-specific Warhammer Armies book about the Empire, which was released in 1993. This book would collect all of the information that had been published in White Dwarf in the preceding months, updating and refining lore and detail that had been created for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay as well. This Armies book was the first such supplement for the 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, which had included a simplified version of the Empire Army list in the box. But here it was really let loose, unleashed onto the battlefields in all of its multicoloured glory. To support the release, there would later be some plastic reinforcements. The humble halberdier would receive a plastic boxed regiment featuring 30 men-at-arms, a mighty force with which to defend Altdorf. The 4th edition Empire Army might be seen by some as the pinnacle of the Empire in the Warhammer game, an army that was inspired by the Holy Roman Empire, and which featured a diverse array of options for both cavalry and infantry, with inbuilt allies like Kislevites, Tyleans, dwarves, ogres, and halflings. The Emperor Karl Franz was even available to lead this mighty force into battle, riding a warhorse or on his favoured mount, the Griffin Deathclaw, the miniature having been created by Trish Carden and Michael Perry and released by Marauder. I would imagine that for many folks, when they think of an Empire Army, the first thing they think of is the one fielded in 4th edition that's included in this book. It is so diverse, has so many options, and yet is so iconic. As well as updating all of the classic stuff we'd seen since the introduction of the Empire, it brings to bear an amazing array of awesome options that's both fantastic and magical and technological in all the right ways. Whilst for some, the 4th edition of the game may well have brought about the definitive version of the Empire Army, we're only halfway through the life cycle of Warhammer Fantasy, and the Empire did not stand still. They would continue to evolve in some ways, as the game also changed over time. With Warhammer's 6th edition, the overall tone and the art of the game became a little bit darker, more grimdark, I suppose, as Mordheim and 40k influenced the Warhammer setting and really brought to life some of those darker elements. There would still be plenty of fantastic stories and wild fantasy stuff, but perhaps in some ways the Empire Army would not be quite as vividly multicoloured as it had been before. The 6th edition would see the release of the only starter box to include the Empire, fighting against orcs, and it would introduce new plastic kits that would stand the test of time. There would be plenty of new miniatures released for the army, but not much in the way of dramatic changes to its composition. In its armies book, it did however see the loss of stuff like the halfling infantry, ogres, and characterful options like the war wagon. It's also worth noting that the game Moor, set 500 years behind the main Fantasy Battle timeline, would introduce a raft of new character and texture to the men of the Empire, with warbands arriving in the Damned City from many of the Empire's greatest territories. The grim darkness of it all was the perfect cover for these new roguish men of the Empire, even if they didn't commonly appear in the armies that would be fielded. This deepened the sense of cultural diversity within the Empire, which was complemented before and during the major narrative event, the Storm of Chaos. In that event, Archaon's plan was centered around a massive chaos invasion with the intention of sieging and destroying the great city of Middenheim. That was a great excuse to bring more warriors of the White Wolf to the tabletop, with priests of Ulrich and the Tutagen Guard of the Warhammer City getting some beautiful models sculpted by Mark Harrison, Dave Thomas, and Adam Clark. The mixed empire of old that featured dwarf and halfling and ogre regiments had long since started to dissipate, and there was a sharper focus than ever on the Empire of Man. And though that as a term did not take any kind of root during Warhammer's original life, it was actually referred to that way in some instances. Sigmar is crowned Emperor. The creation of a new Empire of Man opens up a new age for not only the human tribes, but also the dwarfs who help them on the path to true civilization. The 7th edition also redoubled the commitment to the steampunk aesthetic, with a whimsical abandon unrivaled in Warhammer since probably the Goblin Doomdiver. There was a brand new model added to the range, an innovative invention that was controversial amongst some of the fantasy faithful, the Engineer on Mechanical Steed, that was sculpted by Dave Thomas. By the 8th edition, there was a clear drive across the Warhammer range to up the amount of fantasy on display. And whilst you could argue that might have been possible by going back to an empire that included fantasy units like ogres and halflings, instead, things were taken in a different direction. They would be introducing new units that were far more magical and technological and monstrous than ever before. The Demigryph Knights, sculpted by Mike Anderson, were a major new addition to the lore. It is demigryphs that are chosen as mounts for the most virtuous and battle-hardened knights. But these great beasts have proven themselves as loyal and powerful steeds on countless battlefields in the Empire's proud history. The Celestial Huracanum and Luminarch of Haish, sculpted by Colin Grayson, Neil Langdown and Mike Forres, would rekindle something of the war wagon, melding it with both more magical essence and more steampunk energy. Together with a pumped-up version of Volkmar the Grimm's War Altar, and an even more magnificent multi-option monster kit that could build Karl Franz on a huge version of Deathclaw, the Empire army certainly looked impressive in scale. There have been countless more special characters, lore entries, and other supplemental material from White Dwarf over the years, simply too much to mention in this video. But something that I couldn't neglect to mention is the art by David Gallagher that has so defined the Empire Army since its creation. He was responsible for the cover of the Empire Armies book for 4th edition, as well as the 6th edition and 7th edition covers as well. And many of his pieces are scattered throughout all of the different Warhammer supplements that bring so much life and variation, depth and character to the Empire. There was also an 8th edition Armies book cover illustrated by Paul Bonner, which is another magnificent piece. And perhaps one of the most immersive supplements ever released for the game was Blood on the Reich, which featured many Dave Gallagher sketches for the inhabitants of the Empire. Some absolutely incredible pieces that take readers on a journey deep into the Empire. The Empire, since its inception, occupied an interesting space within the Warhammer game and its whole ecosystem, really. They were central to the stories, and in many ways feel like the default starter faction. But they're actually far more complex and nuanced, both in terms of background and in terms of gameplay, and especially in terms of painting. So, it's not the default starter army at all. If anything, it's one of the more advanced, more complicated armies. So, where exactly were they best placed within Warhammer's world? Their history defined the timeline of the setting, with the Imperial calendar quite literally the measurement by which the setting's lore progressed. And due to their geography and relatability, they often played a major role in the great stories of the Warhammer world. Their lands are the default setting for many roleplay adventures. Their armies featured solid choices for almost any strategy and reasonable counters to many enemies. You could play an all-cavalry force, all-infantry, go heavy on war machines or monsters. One might imagine that they were a bestseller that most players started with, and yet, with so many options, it can be hard to know where to start. And the Empire probably had some of the most complex and variable paint schemes in Warhammer history, not ideal for beginners. It seems the Empire never sold like the Space Marines, even if narratively they may have occupied a similar role for their respective setting. Nevertheless, they held a key place in the fortunes of Warhammer and have been an important element of its life, death, and rebirth over the past 40 years. Across 8 editions of Fantasy Battle, 4 editions of Fantasy Roleplay, countless books, battles, and brilliant miniatures, the Empire has become one of the most iconic features of the Warhammer world. Drawing on real-world history and geography, aesthetics and ideas, the Empire was crafted into a unique take on fantasy humans, and, in my opinion at least, one of the coolest factions in any fantasy fiction. As the old world returns the Empire of Man to the tabletop, it feels like there is a huge opportunity to explore the complications and nuances of an empire divided, an important bulwark against the enemies of mankind, but which can't yet tell whether the enemy is without or within. I hope that you have enjoyed this exploration of Empire history. I know there are an enormous number of tangents that I could have gone down, areas that could have been explored in more detail. I've no doubt that I have missed some key features. Please let me know in the comments below if you enjoyed it and if I did miss anything or there was anything that you think I should have explored in more detail. I would love to know. The only way that I'm able to keep doing this work, researching and documenting the history of Games Workshop and tabletop games, and interviewing the people who made them, is with your help and support. Here on YouTube, you can like this video, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, share the video, and tell people about Jordan Sorcery. And if you have the means and want to help out, you can check out my Patreon. There is a free tier as well as paid tiers, and you get access to exclusive content, behind-the-scenes stuff, regular updates, research documentation, lots of other fun stuff as well. Anything that you can do to support me is enormously appreciated. I am so grateful for all your support. Thank you so much. I just want to keep doing this awesome work. I find it absolutely fascinating, and I hope that you enjoy it as well. Don't forget that you can check out my interviews and podcasts over on the Jordan Sorcery Pods channel. My most recent interview was with incredible sculptor Juan Diaz. We talked about his amazing career with Games Workshop, some of the awesome work he did there. It was a really, really fun conversation. Juan is just awesome. So go and check that out if you're interested. It's also available on podcast feeds as well. Just search for In Conversation with Jordan Sorcery if you want to listen to it instead. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. You know, I was going to write a joke for this bit, but after all of that Empire history, it was longer than I thought it was going to be. Let's just say that.